So basically, we have 7 tips here for an effective ERP selection process, and we'll walk through each of these one by one. First is to define clear goals for your ERP project. Second is to clearly define business requirements in detail. Third is to choose the right software. We want to set realistic implementation expectations, which we just discussed at a high level a minute ago. We also want to involve employees and key users. We want to develop thorough business processes and workflows. And finally, we want to position ERP for benefits realization. So those are the 7 tips that we're going to walk through one by one here this morning or afternoon or evening in the case some of you that are calling internationally. So the first tip then we have for today is to define clear goals for your ERP system and for your ERP implementation. And it may sound like a no-brainer. You know, those of you that have been through an ERP process before may feel as if it's a no-brainer, that you have very compelling reasons to want to implement ERP. A lot of companies we work with, they underestimate or don't focus much time on this activity or this tip because they just know they have to replace their ERP system, or their old legacy system is 20 years old, hasn't been upgraded in 10 years. They no longer can get support for it. So it's not an issue of whether or not they should replace it. They know they have to. So that right there is the goal. Let's replace our old system. And what we found is that's not nearly enough. And companies that set their goals at that low of a level typically fail or have a lot of problems in their implementation. And the reason for that is you have to have a very clear sense of purpose and understanding of what you want to get out of your ERP system. It's not nearly enough to say we just need it to replace our old system because the old one's broken, so we want to find one that's in our budget and at a high level fits our needs. It's not enough. You've got to define what exactly you want to get out of it. What are some of the operational pain points you want to address? What are some of the business benefits you expect to see, et cetera? So you really want to ask yourselves, why do we want to implement ERP? You want to have business-focused goals that are not just focused on technical issues. So a lot of times when CIOs drive these projects, and no offense to the CIOs on the line, but a lot of times CIOs become a little bit myopic and say, you know what, again, doesn't matter. We've got an old legacy system. Our goal is to replace that legacy system. And that surely is an important goal, but there's obviously going to be other issues as well that need to be addressed or other goals that need to be set. We also want to identify and quantify opportunities for improvement as well. So we want to make sure that we understand what those potential benefits are and what the numbers are behind those potential benefits. The second tip we have is to clearly define business requirements in detail. And this one dovetails with the previous point. So first we want to define the goals, but the second tip is to clearly define your requirements and needs in detail. So you want to complete a detailed requirements understanding and analysis prior to the evaluation and selection of a vendor. A lot of companies just want to jump right into getting RFIs and RFPs and seeing demos without really understanding what is it we want the system to do, what are our processes need to look like, what should they look like in the future, and let's evaluate the software options against those processes and requirements. We typically advise our clients to focus on your current processes to identify improvements that will result in your 2B. So a lot of software vendors, if you ask any sales rep or software vendor, or most sales reps will tell you, you know what, don't even worry about your as-is, let's just focus on your 2B. And really the reason for that is because A, it allows them to sell their software, because their software is going to become the 2B if you implement theirs, if you choose their software. But the other thing is that it makes it more difficult a lot of times from a change management perspective if you don't understand the as-is. So the reason you want to start with your as-is is for a couple of reasons. One is so that your people can understand and articulate how the business runs and what your requirements are now in the context of your current operations. And what we typically do is ask, all right, within your current operations, where are the pain points and where are the opportunities for improvement? And we'll facilitate a process to identify some of those things along the way. The other thing we do is we prioritize the requirements that are core competencies. So we want to look at some of the things that are deal breakers and identify the highest priority things that are deal breakers along the way. So things that for example, if you're a multinational company, if you're a global organization, something as simple as multi-currency, multi-language, that might be a deal breaker. You've got to have those things to even consider an ERP solution. So that's the reason we do that. I guess losing my train of thought here. The reason we do that is because we want to help prioritize and sort out, what are the things that are going to help us narrow the playing field from different, from all the 150 or 200 different ERP options down to a handful that we can do a deep dive understanding and analysis of. So those deal breakers are a great way to do that, and those are your highest priority requirements. And then finally, we want to involve employees and stakeholders in the process as well. So we want people on the front lines who are running the operations day to day, who understand how the processes work. They understand the pains of the current model. All those things we want to get from the frontline employees and involve them in the process. The third step is to choose the right software, and that may sound like a no-brainer or kind of a common sense statement given the topic of today's webinar. But the reason we call it out is that you do want to take the time to really carefully choose the right software. It's a decision that shouldn't be taken lightly. And what we found is that any project can fail. Even if you do choose the right software, it's not going to guarantee that your implementation is going to succeed. But there's no way your project is going to succeed if you choose the wrong software. So fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, choosing the right software is simply just the ante to stay in the game. It's not going to guarantee anything, but it gives you a chance of success if you choose the right software. So many companies get past that and just want to just pick something and get straight into implementation. If that's the wrong guess, then you are assured failure. I mean, we've never seen an implementation work when the software isn't a good fit for the organization. And that's why it's important to differentiate between a software solution's ability to meet the business requirements and the software vendor sales hype that you might be hearing all along in the sales cycle. And then a final point here is that you want to avoid choosing ERP solutions that are based strictly on competitor software bandwagons. There's a number of industries where we see this pattern, particularly a lot of times with government entities. We see this. We see it, even in a lot of manufacturing segments. We'll see companies that they just choose a software solution because their competitors are using it, and so they assume it must be a good fit for anyone in their industry. They may choose it because their previous company had used it, or they have a CEO buddy of theirs that uses it at his company, and it works really well. So those are all useful data points, but those certainly shouldn't be the driving forces or the only data points. That should be one of many data points you look at when trying to determine what the right software is for your organization. The fourth tip we have is to set realistic implementation expectations. So we want to make sure that before you commit to a software selection process, you understand what the implementation is going to take. You understand how much it's going to cost, how long it's going to take, all that good stuff. Because at the end of the day, part of the decision process has to involve time, resources, and cost. And that's a big driver for a lot of companies. But you can't make that decision in a vacuum without fully understanding what the implementation is really going to look like. And again, this is where a lot of companies trip up, because they get their proposals from their vendors. They base their cost analysis and comparison on what they get in their proposals, and then come to find out that the vendors didn't have the appropriate assumptions, or the vendor misestimated what it's really going to take. And so those cost estimates or duration estimates were never right to begin with. So that's why it's so important to really understand and have an objective view and analysis of what is this really going to take? How many resources is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? What are some of the hidden non-vendor direct costs? That's the other thing. A lot of companies will send out these detailed RFIs and RFPs, get all this cost information back from software vendors or system integrators, but then they don't factor in all the things that are not related to the technical side of the implementation that a typical software consultant or system integrator is going to focus on. So that's where companies get into trouble, and you have to define all that up front so you know exactly what you're getting yourself into. So when you go to your board or to your management team and say, okay, we are recommending this product, here's how much it's going to cost, here's why we chose it, you want to have a very confident and clear understanding of what that's going to take. So it's important to remember that during the selection process, sales reps are trying to sell, and it's not that they necessarily are trying to mislead anyone, but their job and their incentive is not to set realistic expectations. I mean, that's not what they do. Their job is to show you that their software could work in your company, and that that they'll show you and make you feel comfortable enough that there's not a huge amount of risk of implementing their solution. So along with that comes, some perhaps misset expectations along the way. You also want to benchmark to other projects to define a realistic implementation plan and budget. And again, I'm not talking about anecdotal evidence here, because any one of us here on the webinar here today could probably go out and find a good anecdotal story of a company that implemented their ERP solution in 8 weeks. And things went beautifully. It was great. They didn't have any problems. However, I can probably guarantee that just based on the profiles of the companies that I saw earlier today that are represented in today's webinar, I don't think there's anyone on the call here or any organizations that could implement ERP in 8 weeks. So again, but they're out there. There's companies out there that have done that, and chances are they're very small shops that have very simple requirements, and there's a number of variables that play into that. By the same token, we can all find companies out there that took 10 years to implement their ERP solution and never got anywhere. So again, there's anecdotal stories everywhere. We can all find them, but the better way to handle this is to look at broad benchmarks, look at broad data points that look at across the industry, large samples for your industry, what's going on, what's the trend, and what are the averages. And then you also want to make sure that as you're defining what your implementation looks like during your selection process, you want to make sure that you address the non-technical resource needs that are critical to ERP success. So for example, you want to look at organizational change and training, business process workflow definition, user acceptance, process simulation, conference room pilots and testing, integration testing, all the stuff that oftentimes a software vendor or system integrator isn't going to do, but it's critical to the success of the project, and it's something that you're going to be responsible for managing somehow, but a technical or software resource is typically not going to do those things. The fifth tip is to effectively involve employees and key users. So we know that ERP affects an entire organization, and for that reason, we should consider input from those that know the business the best, and we talked about this on one of the previous slides as well. And we also know that ERP should be a business initiative rather than a technology project. So if you drive it as a business transformation or a business initiative rather than an IT project or a technology project, your likelihood of success increases pretty exponentially, because you want people that understand the operations. You want them being the ones to drive it. Not to say that IT shouldn't play a very important role. Even in some cases, even someone from IT could be project managing, but you really need someone from operations driving it. In fact, if we ever have our choice, if a client ever asks us, we always say that we'd rather have someone from operations managing the project, not someone from IT. And it's, again, no offense to the IT people on the call today, but it's generally you want it to be driven by the operations. You want it to be owned by operations, and you want IT to be the enabler of the project and provide that infrastructure and some of the technology best practices to be able to support that. And the most effective implementations we've seen have heavy user involvement throughout the project lifecycle. So beginning with evaluation and selection all the way through process and workflow definition, system design, testing, go-live support, etc. The sixth tip that we have today for the ERP selection process is to develop thorough business processes and workflows prior to selection. And again, this is sometimes can be a controversial statement or one that a lot of organizations don't agree with or don't understand. And the reason for this is because you can't assume that software can handle everything off the shelf. If you were to put together a checklist of 100 or 200 different requirements that your organization has, and you just wanted a yes/no answer, and you sent that to, say, let's just say 5 different vendors, pick any 5 vendors in the industry, send it to those 5, especially the larger ones, you're probably going to get yeses on 90 to 95% or more of whatever RFI or whatever business requirements you might have. Now, so when you're evaluating software, it's not a yes/no proposition. It's how does the software handle it, and what does it look like, and how well does it do it. So that's where, again, where this whole blind RFI, RFP process can be a little misleading, a little troublesome, especially for government types of organizations, government contractors, large companies that base their procurement decisions heavily on RFIs and RFPs. That's the problem with that process, is that you don't see how the software works. You don't see it in the context of your business processes, and you're not able to evaluate kind of quantitatively but also subjectively at the same time how the software fits. So you want to define your gaps between your as-is and your to-be. You want to define your business processes and workflows at a higher level. You don't want to just see, for example, how the system creates a PO or how you run MRP in the system. You want to see an end-to-end process of how your operations would look, more of like a day in the life of a user in your system rather than a demo. That's a good way to think about, how to evaluate software systems, and one of the best ways, or one of the prerequisites for doing that, is to define your business processes and workflows up front. Along the way, you also want to identify the human aspects of how jobs and business processes will change. So you want to understand how people's jobs are going to be impacted so that you can start to build out the organizational change, communications, and training aspects of your ERP implementation. And you want to clearly communicate changes to employees and build your training activities around your business processes, not the system transactions. So for those reasons, all of the foundation for doing any of the things listed on the slide are to first define your business processes and workflows in pretty good detail. Not to say you want to go all the way down to transactional levels of detail, or you don't need to necessarily map out your processes down to level 4 and 5 at this stage in the project, but you should be at least getting to level 1 or level 2 in terms of depth and how much detail you get into in terms of defining your business processes and requirements. The 7th tip is to position ERP for benefits realization. And it's hard to think about for a lot of companies early on because they haven't even picked the software yet. They're so early in the process, it can be difficult to start thinking about how are we going to realize benefits, because it's so daunting. There's so much that has to happen for you to get there. So a lot of companies don't back up and look at, what is it we want to get out of this, and how are we going to measure it, and how are we going to assure that we get those benefits. So if you don't measure it, you're not going to achieve it. You want to make sure you have a business case with actionable, realistic, and measurable business benefits. And the business case shouldn't be simply used to justify or approve the project. It should also be used as a way to, almost as a benefits realization plan, a way to define how you're going to achieve the benefits. That's just as important as what the justification is as well. And again, a lot of companies become a little bit myopic and short-term focused on, let's create a business case because our board requires it and our internal approval process requires us to have a business case to justify the investment. So let's put together a business case that puts together some high-level metrics, and we'll just get the approval done. That's not enough. That may get you what you need in the short term, but long term, if you don't tie those back to actual benefits and ways that you're going to measure benefits, you're not going to get very far in your implementation. You're certainly not going to get very far after your implementation in terms of getting tangible benefits from the system that you've just spent a large amount of money in.